Thank you, everybody, for joining us in our 88th episode of the Bookworm. I am Angela Unk, Director of Development at the Clements Library, and your host this morning. Just in case you're joining us for the first time, we do use the chat throughout the program, so you're welcome to chime in and change the setting to everyone. But if you have questions, please put those in the Q&A section so that we can keep track of them. And you can also give a thumbs up and upvote other questions so they come to the top of the queue. We have the live machine captions on today, so toggle those on or off and change the size as you desire. And hopefully you can see the speaker and the slides. You should be able to move the separator to make that fit your screen in the way that is best for you. And so thank you for being here. This program is brought to you by the William L. Clements Library, located on the campus of the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. The Clements Library's mission is to collect, preserve, share, and promote the study and discussion of primary sources related to all aspects of history and culture of North America and the Caribbean up to about 1900. I would also like to acknowledge that the University of Michigan is located on the territory of the Anishinaabe people. In 1817, the Ojibwa, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations made the largest single land donation to the University of Michigan, offered ceremonially as a gift in the text of the Treaty of the Foot of the Rapids so that their children could be educated in a Western manner. We acknowledge the history of Native displacement that allowed the University of Michigan to be founded. And today we reaffirm contemporary and ancestral Anishinaabeg ties to this land and their profound contributions to this institution. The William L. Clements Library also acknowledges that it has and continues to benefit from the original land dispossession and established hierarchies of settler colonialism. All right, everybody, we're getting you thinking a little bit about identity and families. So if you haven't taken the quiz yet, the poll question yet, do so super fast. And I'm going to end the poll and share the results. Okay, yeah, so it's fun to see what sort of shapes us most. And it looks like 42% of people said family values and beliefs, but not unsurprising with this group. Next is 30% said shared stories and history. So thank you, everybody, for thinking a little bit about that and taking that poll question. Today's episode is generously sponsored by Cinda Sue Davis. Cinda, thank you so much for continuing your support of the Bookworm and sponsoring today's episode. And now I am thrilled to welcome back to the Bookworm, Martha S. Jones. She is here to talk about her latest book, The Trouble of Color, an American Family Memoir. Martha is the Society of Black Alumni Presidential Professor and Professor of History at Johns Hopkins University. She is the prize-winning author and editor of 4 books, as well as past co-president of the Berkshire Conference of Women Historians, and has contributed to other publications such as the New York Times and the Atlantic. Martha serves on the Clements Library Associates Board of Governors, as well as volunteering for other organizations. Martha, the things that you do, there are so many, but that's a hopefully a nice highlight to let people know some of the activities that you're involved in. And I am delighted to have you here.
Well, thank you. I hope it goes without saying that it's an honor to serve on the board at the Clements, but more because the Clements is my absolute favorite place on earth. And so I'm thrilled to be there, even virtually with you. So thanks so much for doing this with me, Angela.
Thank you. I have very much enjoyed your book, and so I was thinking maybe you could just start by giving people an idea about how this project first took shape. When did you decide that you wanted to tell your family history and story?
Some people will know me for my work as a historian, um, but perhaps have never heard me confess that really the origins of my work as a historian was in my many years as an amateur genealogist, as a family historian. And I really became drawn to history. I was a practicing lawyer. Uh, didn't have very much to do, never had studied history in any of my schooling. But as I think is true for a lot of us, as you sit with elders, you hear their stories, you try and piece them together. And I became just enduringly drawn into the family past in a way that I think was enthusiastic, I'll put it that way, which is to say, long before I was a historian, I spent, vacations going to the archives and trying to ferret out my family past. And so, in a way, you could say this book is a culmination of that. But it's also the culmination of a kind of an introspection, a question about sort of who am I and how am I a reflection of, a departure from, a remix of the family that I come from. And for me, that has been a lifelong question, in part because it's a question that other people have put to me. I think that I'm probably not alone on the call, you know, to have someone say, where are you from? Or what are you? Or, who are your people? Or where does that name come from? And this was something that I had experienced a lot in my lifetime, sometimes in comfortable ways, oftentimes in uncomfortable ways. But because I came from what I think initially I thought was an unorthodox and maybe even illegitimate family past. I'm the descendant of enslaved people. I'm the descendant of enslavers. Um, a long and important saga in American history. I wasn't sure how to tell that story. And so it took me this long, and this book to try and put all the pieces that I had been carrying with me together, and hopefully help them connect to how other people think about their own complicated family stories.
Definitely. Yeah. As you and I were talking before the program officially started, it definitely did that for me. I was also, and you started to allude to this, talking about going into archives and things, but one of the things that, working at a place like the Clements, I was particularly struck um, about you actually talking in this book about going to the different places and what that meant, and how you did the research there. So I thought that was really interesting, but also how what you knew from your family stories and then what you were filling in, what you were hoping to fill in, and sometimes filled in from those archives, but then how your understanding of both of those types of sources, sometimes shifted and changed. And so I think that's a really interesting aspect of this for us all to consider too, from genealogists to historians. just because something is touted as the official record doesn't mean it isn't without accidental or deliberate, you know, uh, errors. And so, can you talk about an example of where you sort of encountered those, um, you know, interesting dichotomies and
Yeah.
how that played out?
Um, I had, as I said, collected family stories. Stories had been passed down. Some of them had even been written down. Um, and it was um, unsettling in a way to begin to contrast those stories with the stories that you find in the quote unquote official record. I'm going to talk about the census, but you can imagine, death certificates, birth certificates, the kind of raw materials that we often use to patch together a family story turned out not to really um, support or fit well with the stories I inherited. And one example is an example from early in the book. It's the from the 1820s and 30s and 40s. Um, my grandfather's family is from central North Carolina. And the story I had inherited from a great uncle was about his grandparents. Um, his grandfather, as he told it, had been a free person of color. Um, and his grandmother had been a so-called white woman. And so that in and of itself is interesting, and there's a
Right.
lot to think about because, of course, marriage across the color line is illegal, had been illegal in North Carolina since I think 1715. So there's a story there already. But when I found these folks, Mary and Elijah, when I find them in the official record, the US Census, they are marked as either free people of color, and later a new category emerges on the census, the M for mulatto, which is kind of a catch-all mixed race category. Well, so these don't quite fit. And um, it helped me to, on the one hand, um, make a commitment to the stories that had been passed down, to try and take my great uncle's story seriously on the one hand, and on the other hand, appreciate that there are lots of storytellers, and the census taker is in his own way another storyteller. Census takers do not travel and visit households in the 19th century to record the heart truth of our families, right? They are doing demographic work for the federal government, and they are working with preset categories. They are working with their own prejudices and their own common sense about who people are. And what I'm able to appreciate, is that um, Mary and Elijah, in order to not only marry, but to make a life, they have 6 children. Um, they they live together for many decades. Um, in order to make that life and to be safe, they have to trick the census taker and the court clerk and other officials, because if they are discovered to have married across the color line, if Mary is discovered to have been a white woman, their marriage will be null and void. They will be guilty of crimes, including fornication and bastardy, which are real crimes in the 19th century. And so I wind up telling a story that doesn't try and settle that for you and say they were really this or they were really that, but to say on some days they may have thought of themselves and lived in one way, and when the census taker shows up, you live in another way. And again, I discovered people crafting family stories that suited the world and the challenges that they were facing. And in the end, I think that lets us discover stories that are much less about, the facts, if you will, and the official paper, and stories that are really about people's hearts, right? How do people make
Right.
sense of who they are to one another and to the world?
Hmm. Exactly. Well, and at some point, can't remember who it was in the book, but you were talking about um, some instance where it was determined that even being 1/32nd, um, was enough in that particular court case for somebody to be considered Black. And that kind of blood quantum thinking, I'm a descendant of the Saginaw Chippewa tribe, and that blood quantum thinking and that governmental imposition of what you are is a really difficult and unfortunate thing because it gets caught up in all these politics of who do you get to say you are versus how do you live versus all of these other things, and how do people perceive you, and that's
Yes.
it's all a very complicated story. Um and and I think that that even even those of us who've maybe settled into to who we are can look back and say, okay, well, that's really interesting. And, why did my great grandparents' names get spelled differently at Ellis Island? And why did, you know what I mean? Those kinds of
Absolutely.
questions, that families maybe stop thinking about. But, when you kind of go back, you're like, huh, well, that's really interesting. What's that all about?
Yeah, and early in this work, it was Native American scholars and storytellers who really pointed out to me a really important distinction that I think runs through the book, right? Which is the difference between measures of blood quantum or parentage as one articulate or one place to look for family, but the other important place to look for family and kinship, right, is in relations, right? And that to me, as someone who had, I guess, come to this story from a genealogical perspective, which
Mhm.
really privileges, blood quantum and sort of related kind of law-bound kind of relations, um, really opened the door to let me probe, but how were people, what were their relations and ties and over time and through community, and shouldn't we take that as its own measure of family, even perhaps when the legal law bound definitions don't add up, and that because it's memoir and not history, I'm not obliged to tell you like what the true answer is.
Right.
I invite you to think about where truth sits for you, and and that across generations those answers will change. And it's certainly
Mhm.
in my family, but I think in many families, and the stories that are told two and three generations back about family are quite different. I mean, you mentioned Ellis Island is a place notorious for storytelling, right? And
Sure.
that immigrants arrive and they understand enough about the rules and the criteria and who is kin already in the US to craft a story that permits them to enter. I think that's one of the, one of the great lessons, right, of the Ellis Island story is about the ways in which immigrants craft and recraft their family story in order to become immigrants at all. And so I like that very much as a touchstone for thinking about how in that generation it was necessary to tell one kind of story. Perhaps in this generation we would tell that story differently, in part because we can.
Right, right, exactly. Um, yeah, so I compared to, histories that you're telling in other books, this one is very personal and very vulnerable. And so at what point did you realize that you really were going to write a book?
Um, I had some really important opportunities to try out what it was like to write in the first person, what it was like to reveal um, uh, myself and my family story. Um, and an important moment was way back now in 2014. It was February, Black History Month, and an editor at CNN asked me if I would pen a Black History Month essay for them. And I said I would. If she would let me write something about family. I had been kind of stewing on this and I had a lot of material. And she let me pen an essay that I think the editors called Biracial and Also Black. And it was about growing up with an ambiguous phenotype, but coming from a family where Black and white people had married and made families, and about some of the misunderstandings and more that have arisen in my life from that. Um, uh, but the thing that happened was when it was published is really the point, which is that within a few days it had 8 and then 9, almost 9 million hits. And my editor said, and there were thousands of comments.
Wow.
And my editor said, I know, the general wisdom is don't read the comments, but I want you to read the comments and kind of dive in a little bit and discover kind of what you've ignited. And
Wow.
I did, and I wrote a follow-up piece. Um, but I can say today, openly, it frightened me that I wasn't sure um, what it was one thing to tell the story, but to then contend with what it generated for other people. And it generated strong feelings. I don't mean people just said that was a nice essay or that wasn't very interesting. It was people, telling their family stories. And painful, poignant. And it took me some years to become the person who could receive that and be in real dialogue with people about myself, but also about themselves. And that's a process, or at least for me, that was a process. And um, I might have been a very, become a very public person talking about my historical work, but it's a different process, I think, to become very public about yourself and your family, or at least it was for me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing. Um, so I guess that leads a little bit to what was the hardest memory to put down on paper?
Yeah. Um, um, well, there's a lot. I'm not dodging your question,
No,
but it's
I know.
to say that one of the commitments I made when I started writing the book was that I wouldn't dodge things that were difficult, things that were painful. Um, I very much a student of um, some of our great contemporary memoirists like Natasha Trethewey and Casey Lehman and others, Jesmyn Ward, um, writers who um, implicitly and sometimes explicitly um, claim memoir as a truth-telling genre, right? And so I had to be willing to confront difficult things. The final chapter is about my parents. I think it won't surprise anybody that's the hardest chapter because these are the folks, in my case, who I knew for the first 5 decades of my life, who's are totally entangled with, who I am, who I think I am, and more. Um, but my father had a particularly, troubled young life and adult life, and um, partly the challenge for me was to tell that life, recount it truthfully, but with compassion. And so I think that for me was the key, that I had to write and rewrite until I was no longer. My editor said at one point, you write like a petulant child. And I said, well, some days I feel like a petulant child, and I hope I'm not alone in that. But that wasn't my goal, right? This isn't a book that's about, revenge or retribution or even remorse, right? It really is at the end of the day about how we learn to love ourselves and love one another as family, even with our flaws and our troubles and um, our imperfect ability to uh, explain who we are and have it all make sense. So I hope I got that right because that turned out to be, and frankly, a very healing, right, kind of journey
Yeah.
for me, right, to understand somebody who you knew and was very troubled on their own terms and to extend them compassion for their troubles rather than simply understanding their troubles for how they troubled you, right? Which is oftentimes, how we might think about parents.
Right, right. Because maybe that has to be the first part of the process, but eventually getting to that. Um, it made me think of this quote that I wrote down, but I was trying to remember. Oh, right. Because at the beginning of the book, you're talking about, this hurtful comment from a classmate about who you think you are. But then, as you start to think about what you're going to write, you say, my best answer would need to explain who we have been, but also how it felt to be us. And I think, you know, you're talking about, okay, trying to balance it out so that that piece of it isn't about you, but it is about your parents. But then also the early people, I think it's, your ancestors, it's really beautiful how you're able to take the information and find and help us think about what it felt like.
Yeah, I think that one of the things I think we often find when we do family history is we lament all the silences and the gaps and the holes in the story. And there are, you know, countless holes in this story, um, even as I like to think that my research was really dogged, and um, uh, but I tried to stop worrying about what I didn't know and really go deep on what I did know. That's important. And that I think we can discover a lot about people. The book opens with a three-time great grandmother who was born enslaved in 1808. Um, you know, I, I maybe have five pieces of paper. I have, she um, is admitted to the Presbyterian Church, and I have the church record. I have her marriage after the Civil War and emancipation. I have her marriage certificate. She files a pension application, and I think I have a couple of deeds. She buys a small house and plot of land with her husband after the Civil War. Um, well, that's hardly a life. Um, but when I drilled into like those moments, um, I came to think that I could know her. And in places where I don't know, I'm imagining, um, in a memoir, I can tell you that because that's part of what we do when we tell family stories is that
Right.
we fill in the holes. And I wanted to say that's okay. With care, with reflection, in dialogue with the world that she came of age in. I think I can tell you something, about how she saw the world and how it felt. And then every once in a while, and in her case, just back to our earlier point, late in her life, she files a pension application because her husband had been a veteran of the U.S. colored troops. And um, the form asks her to enumerate her children. And she has 14 children and only enumerates five or six of them. What's going on there?
Right.
But then we understand that the pension application process was really um, scrutinized Black women, widows, looking to disqualify them for being unchaste or unpious, or, there was a whole morality. And she only enumerated the children that she had born with this man who had been her husband and the veteran. She had other children before that when she was enslaved,
Right.
and she didn't. Now, in her life, she lived with them and loved them, but she couldn't tell that part of the story in that moment. And I felt I could understand her, um, what she was wrestling with in that moment, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that I really appreciate your treatment of that because just listing them as, born and died and married and facts and figures wouldn't have been the truth either,
Yeah.
so this is really lovely. Um, so I mean, I asked you about difficult and all of those things, but do feel like perhaps there were some surprises along the way that you've written about too. So maybe you could share a surprise with us.
Yeah. Um, yeah, surprises. And I think it's um, one of the things that, um, when folks ask me, you know, what should I know about, you know, diving into my family story is, um, just be sure that, whatever story you've written in your mind, whatever story even someone has written down and passed to you, is um, not the whole story.
Mhm.
And in my case, um, I had a great uncle who I've mentioned who was a minister, a bishop, in fact, and a prominent enough man that he was very self-conscious about the family story because he, for him, the family story was an explanation for how he himself had become so distinguished, right? He wanted to tell the story about a distinguished family that helped explain his own accomplishments. And he even told the story to a historian who published it as part of a compilation of stories about sort of mid 20th century distinguished Black Americans. Um, and he told a story about his um, mother's family, a story about them never having been enslaved. And it was sort of a little curious story. She had I guess his grandmother, that she had born children by a man she wasn't married to. He even named the man. Um, but we were always free was basically the story that he told. And that was the story I had grown up with. And I had probably like, you know, built my own story on top of. Um, but I have a cousin because I'm not the only genealogist in our family, and I have a cousin in California who, when the Freedmen's Bureau, the Federal Freedmen's Bureau papers opened up not so many years ago, the Freedmen's Bureau was the federal agency that took over for the Army after the war and was charged with settling formerly enslaved people and refugees from the Civil War. She found a complaint filed by this woman, Isabella, in 1867, the Freedmen's Bureau, and uh, her voice on the page, um, you know, transcribed by a clerk. Um, and not only had she been enslaved, she had been enslaved by the man who had fathered her children. She had been pregnant 9 times. She had 4 surviving children, and she was complaining because her complaint was rooted in a promise that he had made to support her and her children after the war, after emancipation, and he had reneged on the promise. So now um, the bishop's story is unraveling, and his grandmother's story is, you know, um, loud and clear. But again, I hope in telling it, I can both honor the story that she told, which I think is closer to the historical truth, and appreciate that for him, there were reasons why he didn't tell the story the way
Mhm.
she did. That he was, I think, concerned about her reputation, you know, in memory, that her having been the victim of sexual assault was not a story he wanted to put like in a history book and on the record. And maybe it was also a little bit about his own reputation, that he might somehow be undercut in his respectability if his family origin was in part a story about sexual violence. Um, so a surprise and a difficult kind of um, truth um, to contend with um, for me as a descendant a long time later, but a descendant who's grown up in a time where we know how to tell those stories and we understand those stories. There's no longer shame associated with those stories. Um, and so even for me, it's different than it was 2 generations back and then 2 generations before it. Um, so, but you've got to be prepared. And my cousin sent me that document, and I put it away for years. I read the
Mhm.
story, I read her recounting, and I had to put it away. I had to learn a lot more before I was ready to really understand and um, make sense of these contrasting stories.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, the surprises. Exactly. You can't go digging without expecting some surprises along the way. Uh,
In family memoir, one it's not part of my story, but I think most famously and importantly, maybe Danny Shapiro's book Inheritance is about the surprises about family that people are discovering through DNA
right.
analysis. And I especially caution people about DNA because we could fill your whole bookshelf, I think, could be filled with memoirs now about what people just finished Patti Smith's recent memoir, and it's partly about this and what we discover when we delve into the realm of DNA. I have not taken a DNA test. That's important to say, but I appreciate that surprises and painful, unsettling surprises are very much a part of the ways in which um, we're experiencing kind of family history research today.
Mhm. That's interesting. Um, so probably maybe just one more discussion question before we open it up. But this is a question I tried to write down a couple of times while I was reading. So I still never quite got it right. But what what I was struck by at different points in the book are these really strong women who are going through a lot, juxtaposed to these sometimes problematic, especially the slaveholders, but even subsequent generations, these men who have their own demons that they're fighting and who are problematic or complicated in a different way. And so I don't know, did that strike you at all as you were going through?
Yeah, uh, uh, thank you for kind of picking up on that, because initially I thought this would be a family story about women, and that the women would be the thread, um, and um, and I thought the book would end before my parents' generation, so I would avoid the problem of my father, right, as the sort of the direct line. Um, but the more I wrote it, I think that there are ways in which, historically, traditionally, and otherwise, um, on the one hand, women are the caretakers of family, or the primary caretakers of family. And that is true in, I think, this story. So the women become the survivors and the custodians and the caretakers, and are remembered in that way. So partly I'm inheriting, right, the ways in which women were regarded and revered, in earlier generations. Um, I think in some moments the men in this story are more vulnerable. I write about a great grandfather who is a Black Republican activist in North Carolina after the Civil War, and as Reconstruction is violently undone, and he continues to be a party activist in his city of Greensboro in North Carolina. He disappears. He's threatened by white Democrats, white supremacist Democrats in North Carolina, as are other Black men voters in that part of the country. And he literally disappears. And I don't know what happened to him. It's one of those silences that no one tries to resolve in all the stories that have come down to me. And so I recognize that the men in the story, some of them disappear in part because um, they are vulnerable in a distinct way
Right.
from the women. It's his wife who will become the matriarch right? And the woman that we remember, she's the one who's photographed as a grandmother, right? In part because she survives and he does not. Um, so um, so I think there is an important gender element to the story. And it's about different kinds of vulnerabilities, I think, different kinds of vulnerabilities.
Well, thank you for that. I like thinking about it that way. Yeah. So are you working on something new? Will we see
Ah,
something?
that's very nice of you to ask. Of course, I am. Yeah. The last really, actually, going back to my years at Michigan when we worked on the university bicentennial, I had started doing this work that today I called hard histories,
Right.
histories that probe the institutional past. You opened with the Native American land acknowledgement, and one of the projects we did back in 2017 was to literally blow up, enlarge, make visible the ground level plaque that had been the only acknowledgement of that land gift by the university when we got to the bicentennial in 2017. So I'm writing a book about um, some of my experience doing this kind of trying to facilitate this kind of institutional insight and reckoning with the past. Um, and I'd like to try and persuade us that because one of the things I learned in our work on the bicentennial at Michigan and work I've subsequently done at Johns Hopkins and elsewhere is that as communities, we actually are strong enough, robust enough to understand, to learn, understand, incorporate, and reckon with the difficult past. That despite suggest strong suggestions to the contrary in some quarters. Today, I actually have a deep faith in us collectively in our ability to confront what is difficult, whether it's a family story or it's a collective story about a beloved institution or it's a national story, that we have the ability to see those things for what they were, to learn from them, and to continue to have history be a part of, our DNA, right,
Right.
collectively. So that's what the book is about, is really making the case for our capacity, that history isn't something to be feared, that history is one of the tools we have that knits us together and is part of our strength if we let it flourish.
Oh, I love that. And yeah, you're absolutely, I mean, I think that that's a really great insight into
And
how to view it, a tool.
that, if you spend all your days at a place like the Clements Library, you understand that not everything that is being revealed in the collections and the materials is easy or straightforward or might lead us to immediately fill with pride. But you also watch how writers, scholars, thinkers, creative people take that hard material and do important work with it. But I think that if you're if you're not connected to that everyday way in which history is such an essential, important, and strengthening part of our fabric, you might fall prey to the idea that somehow what's in those collections is threatens to harm us. And so making that more visible, what goes on every day at the Clements, I think is part of the goal of the book.
Oh, that's great. Well, I look forward to it for sure. Um, All right, everybody. I am going to do just a couple of housekeeping announcements. And while I do that, think about your questions and put them in the Q&A section. Um, and I will mention that our latest exhibit is up for your enjoyment. To mark the 250th anniversary of the publication of Thomas Paine's Common Sense, students from U of M Professor Andrew Murphy's political science course spent last semester investigating Paine's impact as one of the nation's earliest influencers. We invite you to view the exhibit, Revolutionary Pain, in person from noon to 4, Monday through Friday. And the exhibit is also available online with some additional content. And of course, our guided tours of the Clements also include time to view the exhibit. So we hope that you'll take advantage of one of those ways to check this out. This program is part of the University of Michigan's celebration of Black History Month, and there are still some more programs to continuing throughout the month of February. So check out that website to take part both in person and in some cases like ours online. And next month, I hope you'll join us again. If you're new to the Bookworm, you will receive a reminder next month, and then you can choose to sign on to participate in the live broadcast, or as you will today, you'll receive an email in the afternoon with the resources mentioned during the broadcast and a link to the recordings of old bookworms are all out on YouTube for you to take a look at. And so next month, we're welcoming Molly Beer, author of Angelica for Love and Country in a Time of Revolution. Beer tells the U.S. origin story from the perspective of a woman, Angelica Schuler Church, situated at the heart of the American Revolution and the founding era. So hopefully you'll join us again and tell all your friends too. Uh, if you're interested in becoming a Clements Library Associate or sponsoring a future episode of the Bookworm, you can contact me or Ann Bennington Helber. We're always happy to talk about that. We appreciate your participation in these programs, and if you'd like to get more involved, we would welcome that. Today's episode was generously sponsored by Cinda Sue Davis. Thank you, Cinda, for your ongoing support. All right. Stop sharing and we'll see what is in the Q&A. All righty. Oh, yeah, this is interesting. And at some point in the book, you talked about trying different methods of keeping track of the different family trees too, and who the people are. And so Tom is thinking about this because he's like, how do you keep straight the influence of multiple family lines of both, in all the directions, and how do those influences mix to create your sense of self?
Sure. First, thanks for that, Tom. Um, One of the questions a version of this question I get is, why isn't there a family tree in this book? Um, one answer is that so many people today read books in audiobook, that the visual aids that we once thought were essential, like maps and trees and other things, are, are, are not as germane as they once were. But the real answer is that I found the sort of the metaphor of the family tree to be really how can I put inadequate. to the complicated story that I wanted to tell. I began to feel like my family, if there was a sort of a metaphor, rooted in a plant, it was like a vine and the brambles, right? It was all sort of twisting and turning, um, and that there is this, I think, myth of the American family that is predicated on the image of the stately oak with the sturdy trunk and the orderly branches, and that grandeur, and everybody lines up kind of, along some logical thread. And well, my family doesn't comport with that. And even in our, like today's version of the online family tree, there are not yet drop downs for some of, and choices and labels for some of the relations, the kinds of relations that I was encountering. What is the relationship between an enslaved woman and an enslaver when the two bear children together? Our online programs don't have an answer for that. Historians wrestle with that openly, in their own writing, as do other writers. Um, but the point really is, I found the metaphor of the tree. So I do have a family tree online, which is private, because it's very experimental. It's where I put theories and suppositions, and I hold on to little pieces, but I don't share it in part because I think we take it quite literally, and um, there aren't places for, there aren't connections for all of the ways in which we tell the stories about our families. So the last thing I would say to Tom, though, is that um, partly this book is about the stories I can tell, right? There are many other family stories, there are many other connections. Um, my questions were really about the dilemmas that my family has encountered across generations related to race and color. Um, that's just one way of telling a family story, and there are so many others. And so, um, it, you know, as I would be delighted to have, somebody, a cousin from the next generation, write this story and write it very differently, telling it like with a different set of questions in mind. And they might emphasize other people and other circumstances from the ones that I have chosen to highlight. And so these are family stories in service of an overarching story about race and color in American history, which is the story I was trying to tell.
Yeah. Um, so Miriam is asking you to talk a little more about the less usual types of records you used and the difficulties of digging out, in quotations, the truth.
Yeah. Um, I mentioned earlier a three times great grandmother, Nancy Bell Graves was her name. And um, I mentioned some of the artifacts, which were kind of official. And then there was a cabinet card, a photograph that I had inherited, I think, from my grandmother to my father to me. And it was just among dozens of photos that were shoved into a manila envelope. But it was the oldest one, best I could tell. And so I spent a lot of time um, with her self-presentation in the photograph, right? What she wore, her posture, the props. I learned a lot about the photo studio in her small central Kentucky town. And then I flipped over the card, and sometimes on the back of family photos, someone has taken time to scribble a note and remind themselves. in this case, I think it was my father's sister. I think I recognize her handwriting, and she says, "This is Nancy Bell Graves, born in 1808 in Danville, Kentucky, had seven boys and seven girls. As hard as I tried on the census, death certificates, all of the conventional ways we might look for those 14 children, I never found more than, I think I found a total of eight or nine in the end. Um, but what I knew was that when my aunt made that note, she was likely talking to Nancy's daughter, right, who was her grandmother. And so I went back to that family tree that I keep, and I added those children, even though I didn't have names, I didn't have birthdays, but that for me, it was important to make a place for people who didn't surface, had they died as infants, as so many children did. Had they been sold while she was enslaved? I can't answer that. And yet I wanted to hold a place for those children, um, uh, in a kind of spiritual way, but also in a practical way, reminding myself that I haven't answered all the questions, even about someone like Nancy, who I've tried to know as much as I could about.
Mhm. Right. And I mean, I think um, one of the things that I was really struck by is how many times you encountered documents that were where your ancestors had orally told a clerk or somebody information that was then written down and then they signed with an X. So there's also these moments within these archives where you're discovering something that seems to be in their own voice, even if it couldn't be in their own hand. And I also find I think people you may not think about that, but working at the Clements Library, that's certainly something we see a lot of. And so I'm not sure what my point is. It just felt
Well,
like
I
something I
mean, a
should
part of
say.
it is I try to, as best I can, um, probe who were those scribes? Who
Right.
was that court clerk? Right? Who was that census enumerator? On the 19th century census, the enumerator's name is at the top of the page, and you can dig and know a little something about him. And they were, mostly men in the 19th century. And and there's another story there, right? Was this, particularly after the Civil War, was this someone who had fought for the Confederacy? Is this someone who was a slaveholder? Was this someone who was, had come south after the war from the North? You can begin to um, see where these scribes are coming from. They have official duties, and they also have a perspective on the world. And sometimes it's compatible with, you know, a woman who's standing before them recounting the troubled story of her young life, and sometimes maybe not. And we can recover some of that too, because so many of the stories are mediated through officials and scribes.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, so I Tom has two things that he's put out there, and I think Tom Wagner as well, right? And so I I know he participates in these programs all the time and cares very much about history. So I think this is an interesting question that kind of goes back to that identity one. Why do we really care about the lives of our ancestors that were really different from anything that we're experiencing today? But then also just sort of thinking about, is family ancestry research a way of energizing what we think about to be the true evolution of conventional history? I think those are
Mm,
kind of an intertwined and interesting, almost existential
yeah.
question.
You know, some years back now, I was writing a book and I was working in the Maryland State Archives in Annapolis. And it was at a moment where, one of the, many moments in which the state budget was really under strain. And one of the cuts they made was they closed the state archive to the public. They just ended the public services. And so the archive was still there for the courts and for official business, but there was no more reading room, there was no more access to the records. Well, I was a historian, you know, rightly outraged and ready to, you know, raise a ruckus. But who saved the archives? It was the genealogists, right? The genealogists are there day in and day out using those public records. And they are organized and they have a lobby and they went to the State House and the archives opened back up. So that's a very like nuts and bolts
Right.
answer, but it's to say it was an important lesson and a humbling moment for a historian like me, who wanted to imagine that what really makes this place hum is, some kind of lofty search, for truth. Well, it is, but it's the family history's lofty version of the truth that really makes the place hum. And so it's been an honor in this book, to be in conversation with genealogists, genealogical societies, to continue to learn from people in that field, which has its own set of norms and professional codes. Um, so I think that's one version of an answer to the question. I mean, on the whole other end of the question, um, um, I haven't, though maybe I am now, I haven't met anybody who has said to me, family history, my family past is not, it is not germane to who I am. And, and there are most recently, Karen Wolf's most recent book, Lineage, is just one in a series of Francois Vale's book on family trees. We now have a history of family history. Kendra Field's recent work on this. So historians have really worked hard to explain to us the process by which we come to inherit family history as a seemingly indelible part of who we are in the 21st century. Um, I'll say in my story, um, the and I'm going to date myself, but I hope some of you are with me. Um, you know, it was roots. It was Roots. It was 1976. And for those who don't remember Roots, it was 8 nights on national television, and the nation stopped, and we watched this epic tale of African, and then African American family be told based on the book by Alex Haley. And Roots was a turning point for Black Americans um, because it let us understand that we could recover our family pasts, even though slavery had done a great deal to deprive us of those connections and the records of those connections. Um, that we could tell even the difficult chapters in our family past without shame and without apology. So I believe deeply, right, that each generation has a story, and I am of a roots generation. That means that I benefit in ways that my grandparents and great grandparents did not, from an opening up of a subject and a way of telling our story that hadn't existed. Now, I teach young people who certainly will say sometimes, enough of this past, and enough of the difficult past. And I understand that, but they're not quite saying that family doesn't matter.
Mm,
What they're saying is, in my generation, we want to craft our own family story, and maybe it has less to do with the degradations of slavery. Maybe it has less to do with the violence of Jim Crow, and has much more to do with being the inheritors of a civil rights past. And I think you have to leave people to write the story of their own generation. Um, but I don't meet many people, and it's hardly only Black Americans. I think it's all Americans who touch back and make sense of themselves through family.
yeah, yeah. Oh, thank you for that. Um, Deborah is asking a hard question that
Okay.
probably could be a whole symposium. You have dedicated your career to revealing history, but what is the most effective way today for historians to organize and combat the erasure of history?
Yeah. Um, there isn't one answer to that. I do think we are living that. Um, so I'll just talk about how I approach this. So I write scholarly books and articles. I think that is a way of making a kind of durable record of the past. Um, but I also write for more general audiences, looking to shape the way we understand the national narrative um, as lay people. I spend a lot of time with K through 12 educators, um, bringing to them the kind of work we're doing in the academic setting, and understanding better how that fits with, lesson plans and grade levels and all of those things. Um, these days, I'm writing briefs for federal appeals courts, including the U.S. Supreme Court, to uh, bring history as we've come to know it. I wrote a book on the history of birthright citizenship, some people may know, and bringing that history and making it available to and kind of cognizable to judges who are thinking about the problem, contemporary problem, in part through history. Um, Sometimes I'm a public historian, something I learned to do at the Clements Library with my wonderful partner and co-curator Clayton Lewis, doing exhibitions in grand public spaces where people come to see a little beauty, learn a little bit about the past in another kind of way. Um, and I think so all of that continues. And I think that's important to say that the stories we're going to read, importantly, are about the ways in which history is being suppressed, erased, and removed. But on every given day until this day, and it will be true tomorrow, that historians and librarians and curators, um, archivists, and more are at work preserving, interpreting, teaching, making available our history. That work, is is live and um, uh, and fighting the good fight, right? And fighting the good fight every day. I think that if you're in a setting where history is really being targeted, um, part of the work, as I see it right now, is preserving the space, the remnants, the signs. I don't know if folks have followed the story of the president's house in Philadelphia, but all of the interpretation on that site came down.
Right.
Um, but the vacant plaques were still there. And when a court came in to say you cannot and you have to restore that, the interpretive material could go back up on the plaques. And so don't forget, right?
Right.
That the vacant plaque or the plinth or whatever it is a placeholder and a reminder to us of the work we need to do, right? To restore, to reclaim. And so there is that. And sometimes we're fighting over, I don't know, the space on the library shelf, right? For the books that have been removed until they come back, until we fight to bring them back. And so I know some of us are in those quotidian fights. Is there going to be a history major, right? Well, at least let there be a history minor, right? And we will restore the history major, whatever it is. I think for me, that's part of the work is holding on to those reminders that we're still going to do the work.
Thank you. Um, I April, I don't know what this discussion is, so hopefully this makes sense to you, but she's saying, how has your relationship to the archives changed over the years? I'm recalling Dr. Glimph's marvelous discussion at AHA.
Um, I think that I'm probably um, more dogged and committed to the archive um, and the what is possible in the archive than I ever have been after doing this work. In part because in doing this work, where I thought I was really going to write a family story out of like the things I had saved and collected, the things I had inherited, the stories, it turned out I could find a great deal in the archive about my own family that I had no idea was there. But more to the point, I think that, I am a great admirer of Thavolia Glimph and her address to the American Historical Association, her presidential address, where she really admonished us, not to um, imagine that we've somehow exhausted the archive or, that the archive is done and we've wrung everything out of it and now we need to move to some other interpretive approach. Um, I just think she's correct,
Yes.
that we've hardly exhausted what is possible. And Professor Glimph's point was in part that in our field of African American history, but it's not unique to us, the people who most concern us actually did the thing of leaving their mark on the archive. If you look for it, Angela mentioned the X's. And one of the things that I did years ago at the Clements was study the X's and learn how people, um, some of whom had really mastered the quill and ink, and others of whom was clearly the first time they had ever tried to make a mark on paper. And even the X's tell us a story if we're willing and interested in discovering the stories that they bequeath to us. It is true that we have questions about the past that are difficult, maybe impossible to answer. Um, but that doesn't mean that there aren't stories to be told and facets of the past to discover. And the people that concern us did, in fact, leave us. I think her metaphor was the footprint, right? The footprints that permit us to go back and recover those stories. And so um, I hope my enthusiasm comes through for that work and for institutions like the Clements that safeguard, care for, collect, acquire, and do all the things that make that kind of research possible.
Well, now I almost hate to ask Margaret's question, but I will. What, if anything, did librarians or archivists do that helped or hindered your research? And is there anything you wish they had done differently?
Well, only because Angela knows, I think, what I'm going to say. I don't want to end on a downer, but because it's not a downer.
Right.
I think part of what I learned is that, archivists and librarians, curators are people too.
Hmm.
And when you come in with a question, as I did questions about my family, but about my family and its connections to maybe more distinguished families or better known families, um, that wasn't always easy for the person in charge of the records. And so I met people who hedged and hesitated and that turned out to be part of the story, was what it's like to think that you're going in just to do research in some objective way, and then someone kind of blocks you a little bit. I met a librarian who said to me, be careful with the story that you're pursuing. And woof, that really set me back. But we were going through a thing, and I think
Right.
she was well intentioned in a way. She didn't want me to bump up against somebody who was really going to try and shut me down. But I think she was also protecting kind of the story that the received wisdom in my story threatened to disturb it. So
It
um,
felt like a bit of a cinematic moment. I was like,
eh,
oh no, like there
absolutely,
was a dun dun dun.
but I will say that, and this is the last thing I know, but I learned this at the Clements in my work with Clayton Lewis. I learned this again and again. Our work is relational. And
Mm.
even if I ask you a hard question or I ask you to look for something you're sure you don't have, or I tell you I think there's something in these papers that you say no because I've looked at those papers, we're always learning together about what's in the archive. And that's part of our relationship is that discovery. Sometimes it's delightful and exciting and fireworks, and sometimes it's fireworks, but because it's difficult,
Right.
and but that's part of what we're always doing together, I think.
Yes, yes. Well, as you know, seeing the work that you've done in the archives and the stories that you've been able to tell us, I appreciate that work. I appreciate the work that everyone who comes in does. And I tell people all the time, I learn something new every single day at the Clements Library. Um, and Bonnie just said in the chat, new eyes can reveal a lot of new information. And I was actually a science major, and I always tell people when I'm giving tours and we're standing in front of the gauge trunk, where you can sort of envision how much material there is. And I say, you need to think about this like a big medical data set. We're going to, it was produced to gather all this information, and now it's going to be used for years and years for questions
Yeah.
that the originators of the data set did, can't even expect. And the same is true of the archives of the gauge papers. I mean, they're the questions that people come in asking today of the gauge papers, nobody 100 years ago would have even thought about, because they were, at that point, they were still just trying to figure out the military strategy.
Yeah.
So, um, yeah. So, I mean, I think it's really amazing to think about what the archives are going to lead us to in the future as well, and what wonderful minds like yours will think about and put together. And so we really appreciate it.
I appreciate you all so much. Thanks to everybody, you, but everybody at the Clements for having me. And thanks for everybody for tuning in today.
All right. Well, have a wonderful weekend, everyone. And we'll conclude for today.